At that moment, it was impossible to know that the peace of an ordinary afternoon would be disrupted so suddenly. The sound of motorcycles was still distant, but it would soon invade the park and change everything. For 16-year-old Ethan Carter, the day began like any other. Calm, unhurried, unchanged. Sitting under a tree in the local park, he was engrossed in a book, his eyes fixed on the pages, his body relaxed, as if he were distant from everything around him. He had that kind of calm, a calm that seemed to come from a deep place within, as though he was always prepared for whatever the world might throw his way. Ethan wasn't the type to show emotions easily. He had a self-control that many envied. Even the scene around him, children running and playing, couples walking their dogs, the sound of laughter in the background, didn't disturb him. He was focused, paying attention only to what truly mattered, the book in his hands. But there was something in the air, something he couldn't identify, yet he knew it was about to happen. It was an instinctual feeling, like a premonition, and as he read, the peace of the moment began to crack. The distant sound of engines reached his ears, faint at first, like a hum on the horizon. Ethan didn't rush to look up, but something in the increasing rhythm of that sound told him it wasn't just something simple. The noise grew louder until it was deafening, and he finally lifted his eyes from the book. 5 motorcycles appeared at the park entrance, their engines roaring loudly, cutting through the afternoon calm. Ethan furrowed his brow, his mind immediately sensing something was wrong. The bikers, as if they were in an action movie, abruptly parked near the soccer field, causing a small stir among the passers-by. The smell of gasoline in the air, mixed with the sound of tires screeching against the asphalt, made any remaining sense of peace vanish quickly. Everyone in the park seemed to momentarily become more alert, more aware. Curious glances turned toward the bikers but soon transformed into expressions of discomfort. Among the 5 men who had arrived, the most imposing was Trevor "Tank" Mitchell. His nickname was no accident. He was large, muscular, and the way he moved exuded a confidence that didn't go unnoticed. His eyes, hidden beneath a fringe of dark, unkempt hair, seemed to scan every corner around him, as though the park were an extension of his territory. He wore a black leather jacket, tattoos exposed on his arms, and carried the typical defiant attitude of someone who knew that his presence made any place feel smaller. Trevor dismounted his bike with a wide, arrogant grin, his posture dominating the space around him. The other bikers, less imposing but equally intense, stood by their bikes, talking quietly among themselves, clearly more interested in maintaining their group's image than in interacting with anyone else. They gave the impression that they were there for a specific reason, but no one knew exactly what that was. Ethan, for his part, didn't change his posture. He stayed where he was, his eyes now on the bikers but without making any abrupt movements. He knew the situation was shifting, but he still didn't know in what way. The afternoon's tranquility had been altered, but he remained calm, not allowing the tension to consume him. Something in the bikers' behavior didn't seem right. The way they spread out across the park, the way their gazes passed from one person to another, as if they were looking for something. It was when one of the bikers looked directly at Ethan that his expression changed. There was something provocative in the way he observed him, and the others, noticing, moved closer. Trevor, the leader, walked slowly toward Ethan, his heavy steps sure but deliberate. He seemed to enjoy making an impact. He looked at the boy in the black suit with a grin that wasn't welcoming. "How about enjoying the day, kid?" Trevor said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But Ethan, without changing his expression, didn't respond. He knew the best course was to remain calm, not to feed into the provocation. Yet the sound of the motorcycles still reverberated in the background, a constant reminder that somehow this day wouldn't unfold as expected. The other bikers moved closer, forming a circle around Ethan, watching him with unsettling curiosity. There was something in the air that no longer made sense. They were clearly provoking the young man, trying to elicit a reaction. But Ethan remained unfazed, his eyes fixed on Trevor, analyzing every word, every move. It was then that Oliver, Ethan's younger brother, appeared on the soccer field. He seemed unaware of the tension in the air, but upon seeing what was happening, his expression changed. Without realizing the immediate danger, Oliver walked toward Ethan, unaware of what was about to happen. Trevor, noticing Oliver's arrival, saw an opportunity. With an even wider grin, he made a sarcastic comment about Ethan's brother, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Ethan felt the pressure mount. He knew the situation was about to spiral out of control. He couldn't allow it to escalate, especially with his brother so close. The peaceful afternoon had dissipated, and what was about to happen would not only change that moment, but perhaps the way Ethan saw the world around him. He knew it would take more than self-control to deal with what was coming. Something in the air was about to turn into something much more intense, and Ethan, though calm, knew he was about to be challenged in a way he had never imagined. The leader, Trevor "Tank" Mitchell, walked ahead with heavy, confident steps, as if he knew this moment was being created for him. The other bikers followed in a formation that seemed rehearsed, creating a sense of imposing unity. Every movement, every word, appeared carefully calculated to keep the audience's attention, as if they were on a stage and Ethan was the star of the show. Ethan felt the weight of the situation but didn't give in. He stayed under the tree, reading his book, his eyes still fixed on the pages, but his mind was far away. He knew the bikers were trying something, maybe testing the limits, but he didn't know exactly what it was. Trevor and his friends, with their motorcycles still roaring in the background, approached where Ethan sat. It was impossible to ignore their presence, which, though not aggressive in words, carried a palpable tension. Trevor, with an arrogant smile on his face, stopped just a few feet away from Ethan. He stared at the boy, the distance between them growing with every passing second. Trevor's posture was almost provocative, as if waiting for a reaction, a sign that he was hitting the mark. "I didn't know a kid in a suit like to sit alone in the park," Trevor said, his voice laced with sarcasm. The other bikers chuckled quietly, but the sound was more one of disdain than genuine laughter. What irritated Ethan the most was the way they seemed to enjoy it, as if they were there just to make him uncomfortable. Ethan didn't look up from his book. He didn't need to. He knew that any movement, any sign of weakness could be interpreted as an opening for more provocation. Trevor, realizing he wasn't getting an immediate reaction, took a step forward, closer to Ethan. He crossed his arms, observing the boy with a look that seemed to challenge him to respond. "Think you're just gonna sit there all day without saying a word? Not even a little curious about who we are?" Trevor continued, the provocation obvious. The other bikers began to close in, getting closer to Ethan. It was as if the space around him had shrunk, and there was no escape from the mounting pressure. Ethan felt the shift in the air, but he didn't let it affect him. He knew what Trevor was trying to do. They wanted a reaction. They wanted to see him lose his composure. But Ethan had something Trevor didn't understand: self-control. No matter how hard they tried, he wouldn't give them that satisfaction. But there was something Ethan knew he had to do. Oliver, his younger brother, was there. Ethan felt a heavier weight on his shoulders as he realized that any mistake could put him at risk. Oliver, unaware of the growing tension, was focused on his football practice, oblivious to what was unfolding. But Ethan knew that at any moment he could get involved without realizing it. And that's exactly what Trevor noticed. He glanced at Oliver, who was now starting to approach, and his smile widened. He knew he could use Ethan's brother to push him even further. Trevor stepped to the side and gestured with his hand, drawing everyone's attention to Oliver, who was running toward Ethan. "Look, it's the little brother of the suit-wearing kid. I wonder if he's tough like his brother," Trevor said loudly, his tone dripping with malice. He turned to the other bikers and laughed, while the others exchanged looks of complicity. They were enjoying this, having fun with the situation. Ethan could no longer ignore it. He knew the situation was becoming more serious. They weren't just there to provoke. There was an intention behind Trevor's words, an intention to pressure, until someone reacted, until the calm was shattered. And with Oliver there, the situation became even more complicated. He didn't want his brother to get involved in this, didn't want him to see what was about to happen. He glanced at Oliver, who was now closer, and tried to give him a silent signal that everything was fine. But Oliver, with the innocence of someone who didn't realize the severity of the situation, was still smiling, distracted by what was happening around him. Ethan knew he needed to act soon, before anything happened. Trevor then approached even closer. His presence seemed immense, and he looked at Ethan with a defiant smile. He was enjoying himself, liking to see the boy maintain control, but he wanted more. He was willing to go further to break that calm. "You're just gonna stay there, huh?" "Watching," Trevor said in a lower, almost threatening tone. "Because if you don't do anything, it won't just be you who regrets it." Ethan knew this was no longer just a game. It was starting to become a real threat, and he needed to decide what to do before things spiraled completely out of control. He felt the pressure mount, the sense that if he didn't act now, everything could explode. Oliver was getting closer, running toward his brother. His steps were quick, his face still glowing with the excitement of the soccer practice, unaware of what was about to unfold. For a moment, Ethan wished he could stop time, make Oliver turn around and head home, but he knew that wasn't possible. Trevor, once again, was about to test his limits. The leader of the bikers, realizing that Ethan hadn't responded to the provocations as he expected, decided it was time for a new approach. He smiled enigmatically and glanced around at the other men. They were silent, watching intently. The moment stretched on, as if the tension in the air had become something palpable, something inevitable. Ethan, without lifting his gaze, felt the pressure mounting. He already knew that Trevor's words weren't just empty insults. There was something deeper in his intentions, something that couldn't be ignored. Oliver, still oblivious to the risk, was nearly at Ethan's side. His eyes were sparkling, likely still thinking about how fun the afternoon had been, unaware of the shift in atmosphere. Ethan tried to force a calm smile toward Oliver, a silent attempt to reassure him that everything was fine. But Oliver, like any young kid, was more interested in what was happening with the bikers. He looked over at them, his eyes widening with curiosity. "Hey, Ethan, who are these guys?" Oliver asked, his voice still full of energy and carefree excitement, as if the situation was just an interesting novelty. Trevor, hearing Oliver's question, seized the opportunity. He stepped closer to the boy and, with a malicious grin, said, "These guys, we're just friends of your brother. Didn't he tell you about us?" Trevor's tone carried something that only Ethan understood. It was a deliberate attempt to create a connection, to draw Oliver closer to his intentions. Ethan, inwardly, felt a tightening in his chest. If he didn't take control of the situation now, everything could spiral. He forced a smile for Oliver, trying to hide his growing discomfort. "It's all right, Oliver. Let's head home. This isn't the place for us," Ethan said calmly, though there was a subtle tension in his words. He made a move, standing slowly, attempting to pull his brother away from the bikers. Oliver, as always, didn't notice the danger, and with the curiosity of someone who doesn't understand the true risks of the world, said, "Oh, it'll be quick, Ethan. Just a minute. They seem cool." Ethan knew he couldn't force Oliver to grasp what was going on, but at the same time, he couldn't let his brother stay so close to something that was about to turn dangerous. What had started as simple provocation now showed its true nature. Trevor's disdain was growing. He wanted more than just empty words. He wanted a challenge. Ethan braced himself. He knew that before anything worse happened, he needed to act. Trevor was now so close that his shadow seemed to envelop Ethan. Trevor's smile was more of a challenge than a greeting. What did he want? For Ethan to lose his composure? To show anger, fear, or even hopelessness? But Ethan, with all the discipline and self-control he had acquired, knew exactly what he needed to do. He looked at Oliver, still distracted by the group, and in one fluid motion, pulled him closer. Ethan turned his gaze directly to Trevor, not with fear, but with a certainty that Trevor hadn't expected. "Look, Trevor, you and your friends have a different idea of fun than I do." "Let's leave it at that," Ethan said, his voice firm but without aggression. He knew his challenge lay in remaining calm, not in violence. Trevor's smile faltered but didn't fade. He stepped closer to Ethan, his eyes gleaming with the desire to push things further. He wanted to see how far Ethan would go. He wanted to see if, at any point, Ethan would lose control, something Trevor seemed to believe was inevitable. "You think you can just send us off like that, kid?" "You sure about that?" Trevor said, now in a tone of challenge, his muscles tensing beneath his leather jacket. Ethan, with steady eyes, didn't waver. He knew the moment was coming, that Trevor was ready to push him even further. Ethan glanced at the other bikers, now circling around, waiting for something to happen. They were biding their time, ready to jump into the conversation, ready to make the situation even more uncomfortable. But Ethan knew that if he didn't take the lead, now the provocation would never end. The tension in the air was thick. The space between them seemed to shrink, making the scene feel even more claustrophobic. Ethan wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was defending Oliver, defending the idea that nothing, no matter how imposing a gang of bikers was, could break the control he had fought so hard to maintain over the years. "You can try, Trevor," Ethan said, his voice as calm as a quiet river. "But I'm not a toy for you to play with. If you think you can intimidate me, you're very wrong." In that moment, Trevor stopped. He looked at Ethan, and a heavy silence hung between them. It was as if the test had been passed, but the battle was still ongoing. Trevor's expression shifted, a mix of respect and frustration, as if he were beginning to understand that the game wasn't as easy as he had thought. But Ethan knew the game wasn't over. It had only just begun. The moment Trevor advanced was like the snap of a trigger, abrupt and fast. He took a firm step, his eyes locked on Ethan with barely concealed fury. The rest of the biker gang stood in silence, but the tension in the air was palpable, as if the next move would be crucial in deciding everything. Ethan, however, did not move. He wasn't worried. His mind was clear, and every move he would make next was perfectly calculated. Trevor tried to intimidate with an aggressive approach, rushing at Ethan with the intent to shove him. He was quick, but Ethan was quicker. When Trevor attempted to grab him, Ethan sidestepped with an impressive fluidity, as if he had anticipated every move. Trevor's shove passed like a gust of wind, and Ethan used the force of the attack against him, slipping behind and pushing Trevor to the ground with a single motion. The impact was sharp and loud, as if the earth had swallowed the weight of the biker leader. Trevor lay there for a moment, trying to regain his senses, not understanding what had just happened. The biker gang seemed stunned, and the surrounding crowd in the park fell silent, unsure of what to make of it all. Trevor stood up with a grunt, fury and embarrassment etched on his face. He looked at Ethan, who was now in a combat stance, calm as ever. Ethan knew this wasn't just a simple provocation, and Trevor wouldn't back down easily. The fight had only just begun, and this time it wouldn't be just words exchanged. "You'll regret this," Trevor growled, his anger clear, trying not to show he was losing control. He took 2 quick steps toward Ethan, his fist clenched for a strike aimed at his face. But Ethan was prepared. With the fluidity of a dance move, he dodged to the side, feeling the energy of the blow pass him like a lost beam of light. Taking advantage of Trevor's weakened movement, Ethan spun quickly and precisely struck the inner part of Trevor's arm, making him release his fist, the punch harmless as it veered off course. Trevor stood there, speechless, feeling the weight of defeat for the first time. He quickly regained his composure, but his rage was visible. He wasn't used to being humiliated like this, especially by someone so young. His reaction was immediate. He signaled to his friends, and the first 2 advanced at once to encircle Ethan, who didn't have a moment to relax. The game was changing. But Ethan had faced situations like this before. His years of martial arts training, his calm under pressure, were the keys to his survival here. When the first biker approached, Ethan crouched down and, with a precise movement, extended his leg to trip him. The biker's body was thrown to the ground fast and forcefully, his vision of Ethan disappearing as he fell backward. The second attacker came without thinking, charging directly at Ethan's back, but Ethan was faster again. He spun in an angular motion, grabbed the biker's arm and twisted it, causing him to lose his balance and fall to the ground without a word. It was as if time had paused for a moment. Ethan was in control. The park was now silent, but not from calmness. It was the silence of surprise, of uncertainty. The few people who had stayed to watch didn't know what to say, unsure whether what they were seeing was real. Ethan's skill was unbelievable. He wasn't fighting like an ordinary boy, but like someone who knew exactly what they were doing, someone who had years of discipline and combat knowledge. He wasn't the hero of the situation, but he had become the unbeatable figure. Trevor, angrier than ever, shouted and tried again, charging at Ethan with animalistic fury. But this time, he was blinded by rage. There was no control left, only the need for revenge. He advanced in a disorganized manner, throwing punches and shoves with everything he had, but Ethan was more astute. He dodged once again, almost as if he were dancing, with Trevor's body now in his control. Then, in a perfect motion, he used Trevor's own weight against him, putting him into an arm lock that completely immobilized him. The biker leader was trapped, unable to move. "It's over," Ethan said, his voice cold, emotionless. He didn't want to fight anymore, but he knew Trevor needed to understand that there was no room for further provocation. The other bikers watched, not knowing what to do. Trevor twisted for a moment, trying to break free, but Ethan's gaze never wavered. There was no rush. There was no desperation. Ethan was in control. The fight, which had started with shouts and tension, was now coming to an end. Trevor looked at his friends who were on the ground, defeated and unable to get up. His anger still burned, but he knew continuing would be pointless. He was no longer in a position to threaten anyone. With one last hateful glance at Ethan, Trevor struggled to his feet and signaled for his friends. "Let's go," he said, his voice hoarse, muffled by the pain. Ethan stood where he was, unmoving, until the last biker had walked away. The sound of the motorcycles began to fade as the group left. The tension still hung in the air, but the sense of relief was inevitable. The crowd began to disperse slowly, as if the show was over. But Ethan knew this wasn't the end, just a chapter. Oliver approached, observing his brother with a mix of fascination and concern. He didn't know what to think. He had always known Ethan was different, but he had never imagined his brother could face so many at once with such calmness. He looked at Ethan, but his brother seemed uninterested in talking about what had just happened. Ethan was processing the experience, aware that it wasn't over. "Are you okay?" Oliver asked, but Ethan simply nodded, his eyes fixed ahead, still reflecting on what had just transpired. He knew the battle wasn't over. The sound of the motorcycles slowly faded, but strangely, the atmosphere around Ethan still felt tense. The voices from the park gradually returned, but the weight of what had just happened hung over everything. The laughter and chatter from families could not hide the spectacle that had just unfolded before their eyes. Ethan stood still, his gaze fixed on the path the motorcyclists had taken. He knew this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Trevor, the leader of the group, walked away, with his friends head lowered, shoulders tense. The arrogance that had once defined his every move was now replaced with defeat. But there was something else, a silent promise of revenge. Even without a word spoken, Ethan could feel Trevor's anger in the air. He didn't care, of course, but the fact that Trevor could return at any moment and that it wasn't over yet was an undeniable truth. Ethan knew violence wasn't the solution. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he understood that peace would only come when his enemies realized he wasn't someone to be easily taken down. The motorcyclists continued to disperse, but just as Ethan was about to move on, Trevor glanced over his shoulder. His gaze was filled with fury, something threatening. "This isn't over, Carter," he shouted, his voice laced with contempt. The words sliced through the air, silencing everyone around, but Ethan didn't move. He simply watched, emotionless, unfazed. Trevor took a step back, still glaring at Ethan, with hatred in his eyes. "We'll see what happens next time," he muttered, quieter now, almost like a promise. The other bikers, still recovering from their defeat, didn't dare take another step. The shame was evident on their faces, but Trevor, as the leader, seemed determined to maintain the posture of someone who would not admit a public defeat. Ethan, however, didn't respond. He knew words no longer mattered. Trevor's gesture was enough to make it clear that peace wouldn't come easily. But the young man wasn't worried. He knew Trevor and his friends, now humiliated, were likely just looking for an excuse to return, stronger and more aggressive. But Ethan also knew something else. The arrogance that Trevor displayed was a reflection of the insecurity he was trying to hide, and that wouldn't last long. Slowly, the motorcyclists disappeared over the horizon, the sound of the bikes softening as they moved farther away. The park, once filled with tension, seemed to return to normal, but for Ethan, the air was still thick. He felt that what had happened there wasn't just a simple dispute. It wasn't just a physical clash. Today's confrontation had been a reminder that there's more to people than meets the eye. It wasn't just about power or strength. It was about control of the situation, about not yielding when things got tough. Oliver stayed by Ethan's side, still silent, watching the last traces of the motorcyclists fade into the road. He didn't understand everything, but he knew something big had happened. His brother, always calm and centered, had faced something unexpected and come out victorious, but it didn't seem to bring him any satisfaction. Ethan was different after the confrontation. He didn't feel invincible. He knew there was still much to learn, much to face. But above all, he knew that what had just happened wasn't just about defending himself or his brother. It was about knowing that at some point, somewhere, control would always return to his hands. The sound of the bikes was now distant, but Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before Trevor and his friends tried something else. He wasn't scared, but he was alert. The silent war had begun, and as always, he was ready. Oliver took a step closer. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked, the concern still evident in his tone. Ethan looked at him, feeling a lightness that only came from the calm of having done what needed to be done. "Yeah, Oliver, I'm fine. But never forget that battles don't end just because the enemy walks away. The real fight begins after that." The two of them began walking toward the park exit, their steps light against the pavement. Ethan didn't need words to express how he felt. What had happened there wasn't a simple victory. It was just the first step in a fight that, though he didn't know where it would lead, he had already decided to face until the end. The sky over Fairfield was beginning to change color, tinged with a soft orange as Ethan and Oliver walked home in silence. The park, now nearly empty, seemed insignificant compared to the turbulence that had just unfolded there. But as the calm returned, the feeling that something had shifted still lingered in the air. It wasn't just the day coming to an end. It was something inside Ethan. He couldn't explain it, but something had broken. Something he didn't fully understand yet, but he felt like he was about to discover. Oliver walked beside Ethan, his eyes fixed on his brother, still trying to process what had just happened. He wasn't afraid, but the adrenaline from what they had just lived through still pulsed in his veins. What struck him most wasn't the fight itself. It was the way Ethan had handled everything. The calmness, the precision, the lack of fear, how he made it all seem so easy, like just another training session at the dojo. But it wasn't. It was real. And as much as Oliver tried to understand, he knew he would never have the same tranquility as Ethan. "Ethan," Oliver started, his voice a little more tense than usual. "Don't you think you went too far? I mean, that was a street fight. What if they come back? What if Trevor doesn't give up that easily? Ethan didn't respond immediately. He was absorbing it all, reflecting on the experience. What had happened? How did he feel when he saw Trevor and his friends retreat? He wasn't worried. He wasn't satisfied. He was just aware that it wasn't over. It wasn't about winning or losing a fight. It was about having control, being prepared for whatever came next. "I know what you're thinking, Oliver," Ethan finally said, his voice calm but with an intensity that didn't go unnoticed. "I didn't look for that fight, but when you're challenged, you have to know what to do. You can't be swayed by their words. If I had backed down, it would have been seen as weakness. And, in the end, it's weakness that attracts trouble." Oliver didn't say anything more, but he couldn't stop thinking about Ethan's words. His brother was right, but what he didn't understand was why Ethan didn't seem to care. He didn't seem worried about what the future might bring, about what those men might do to get revenge. To Ethan, it seemed like none of that mattered. They arrived home in silence, the sound of the doors closing behind them echoing in the emptiness of the entrance. The house, which had once seemed like a peaceful refuge, now felt almost empty. There was no one in sight, but the silence inside felt heavier than ever. They knew their mother, the only person who could truly understand, was probably somewhere in the house, waiting for them. Ethan took off his jacket and walked to the kitchen, where the soft light illuminated his mother's face as she prepared dinner. She didn't look at him immediately, but she knew he was there. She always knew. "Mom, you won't believe what happened today," Oliver said, the words rushing out, an attempt to break the tension. He walked over to the table and sat down, his gaze searching for some kind of reaction from their mother. She lifted her eyes, a look of concern and curiosity in them. "What happened, Oliver?" Her voice was calm, but there was a lightness in it. That spoke more than words could. Ethan stood still, observing the interaction between them. He knew his mother cared, but at the same time, he knew she couldn't fully understand what had happened. She would never fully get it. No matter how many times he tried to explain, her reaction would always be the same. Worry, but also relief, that he had returned safely. Oliver began to tell the story, as if it was about to explode out of him. "Ethan, he faced a group of motorcyclists. They were bothering people in the park, and Trevor, their leader, he tried to attack Ethan, and..." Before Oliver could finish his sentence, Ethan cut in. "I handled it, Mom. It's fine." He didn't want to dramatize it. He didn't want her to worry more than she already was. The important thing was that everything was under control. She looked at him with narrowed eyes as if trying to gauge the seriousness of his words. "Ethan," she said, her voice low but filled with concern. "You know you can't be getting into fights, right? I've always taught you to stay away from unnecessary conflict. I don't want you getting hurt." Ethan, however, didn't feel guilty. It wasn't a fight he chose, but a matter of principle. He knew his mother wanted to protect them, but the circumstances were different now. He wasn't afraid of whatever came next. "I didn't get hurt, Mom. I did what I had to, and I'll keep doing what's necessary." She sighed, the weight of her concern evident on her face. But when she looked at Ethan, something in her expression softened. She knew he was growing up, and that the calm and self-control he had shown that day were part of who he was. Even if she didn't fully understand, she knew her son had something in him that made him different from others. And, in a way, she felt proud of that. "I just don't want you to take unnecessary risks, Ethan," she said finally with a look of love and concern. "The world isn't always fair, and we won't always be able to control what happens. Just please, next time, think carefully before you act." Ethan gave a small smile, not to minimize her concern, but to show that he understood. "I always think, Mom. Always." Dinner was served in silence, but there was a sense that something had changed. Ethan, sitting at the table, knew his mother loved him, But he also knew that she wouldn't be able to understand the complexities of the life he was starting to face. He had a lot to learn, but the experience of the day only reinforced what he already knew, that he couldn't avoid the challenges, but he could face them with control and courage, and even at home, in the comfort of family, he couldn't ignore the feeling that Trevor and his friends hadn't disappeared for good. Something was still coming, and Ethan was ready.